Welcome to session 3 of Understanding Human Evil. This third session is going to focus pretty much on the work of Immanuel Kant. And Kant is not for the faint-hearted, but he gives us something very useful as a way of framing certain aspects of evil, which I think we will be able to use as a basis for some of our content in some of the later sessions. Just to review, thus far we have taken a definition of evil which focuses very much of it in terms of the consequences, a consequential understanding of evil as the production of suffering. We've used that as part of a definition or getting others to do so. We've also looked at two main sort of tributaries of understanding within the intellectual world, from theology and philosophy, in relation to what's called a privation theory and the dualist theory. So I want to just briefly dig down a little bit deeper into these two in terms of the implications that they have for how we treat the problem of evil. Because it really does make a difference, and even though I've said at the beginning about not wanting to be too abstract in this, it really makes a very practical difference depending on which view of evil we take. The privation view, as I said, is the absence of the good, and the people who, from Rousseau on, who really accepted this view, and I would say that they are in the majority, produce strategies for managing the problem of evil that are grounded on the notion that the evil is actually externalized. It is as a result of the external conditions to which the human being is responding. Susan Kappeler, she's a philosopher who's written quite widely on this matter, and she says some things that I think are worth quoting because I think she gives us a good sort of insight into what the implications of this are. She says, that if you take people's evil behavior or violent and destructive behavior as a result of their circumstances, then there's an advantage to this. There's also an implication, which is that essentially this will imply that the solution lies in changing the circumstances. And she feels that this is a much more accessible and easily accepted political position to take, because it's something that we can actually do. It is a practical element to it. And she says, quote, "Even if changing the circumstances, combating poverty, unemployment, injustice, etc. may not be easy, it nevertheless remains within our scope, at least theoretically, and by means of state power. So now we can do something about it. Changing people, on the other hand, is neither within our power, nor, it seems, ultimately in our interest. We prefer to keep certain people under control, putting limits on their violent behaviour, but we apparently have no interest in a politics that presupposes people's ability to change." So this, I think, is a really, really useful point to be making about it, which is that the focus stays on what we can do, combating poverty, providing more welfare, and all that goes with that. And the hope is, and this is why it's a very optimistic view of human evil, is that this, because the evil has been caused by the circumstances, then the evil will be defeated when we change the circumstances. That's the implications of the privative view or the privation view. Now, you'll also know that I've been more inclined to take a view of a dualist view of human evil, and this is going to take us into the work of Immanuel Kant, because we need to dig a bit deeper into what that might mean. And in doing so, we're going to come across the term radical evil. Radical evil is the term that Immanuel Kant used to describe how he sees the problem of evil in the human functioning. And it's very important to realize that radical in this context does not mean extreme. It does not mean sensational. We say, God, it's a very radical point of view. And oftentimes we mean by that, we mean extreme. This is not what Kant means. What Kant means in terms of radical evil is he means it's at the root of human functioning. So think radish. A radish is a root vegetable. And so when I think Kant's radical evil, I think about radishes. because it helps me to understand that what he's saying is that evil is at the root of the human being. And this leaves us then into probably the strictest form of the dualism. So let's have a look at more clearly at what he means by radical evil. For Kant, he views the human being as profoundly influenced and profoundly affected by their own choices. He puts the problem of evil center stage in how the choices that people make. And the main focus for Kant is that the choice is whether the person uses the moral law, the good, as the fundamental principle of behavior, or whether they use their own inclinations. Now, this is really interesting because this would suggest that we never know by the consequences. That's the difference. This is called a deontological view rather than a consequentialist view. We can't know from the outcome of a certain behavior whether the person was involved in evildoing or not. Now, I don't agree with Kant's definition of use of the word here, evil, in this context, because it doesn't matter what you do, it's the motive that makes the difference. So let's say that I see the proverbial little old lady crossing the road, and I want to help her. And the reason I want to help her is because I feel good when I help her. I'm not doing this because it's the right thing to do or it's the moral law. I'm doing it because it actually makes me feel good. That is a selfish motive. So Kant makes this distinction between something being morally right, regardless of the emotional feelings that a human being has about them, on one hand, and secondly, that human beings have the inclinations, personal inclinations, to suit themselves. And he makes this distinction quite sort of surgically. He believes that every human being has a fundamental experience or understanding of what is right, what is good, the moral law. And this suggests, essentially, from a Kantian point of view, very similar to a Christian point of view, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, that morality exists in the world. There is a moral law in the same way as there are physical laws that govern the physical universe. So there are moral laws that govern the morality of human beings. And every person has an opportunity to know those. Now, some people know them more clearly, they've thought about them more, whatever, but everybody has the responsibility and the possibility of knowing the moral law. So for Kant then, the moral law stands on its own merits, and we must incorporate that moral law into our behavior if we are to be good people. And for Kant, this is very, very difficult to do because we do not do that more in a very clear way. We will always have a certain conflict going on between the moral law that we hold on to, that we attest to, that we incorporate. He calls these the maxims that we incorporate into our heart, on one hand, and our own sensual predispositions for pleasure, for satisfaction, on the other. So he sees no moral virtue in somebody doing really lovely things if it's actually simply coming out of their own sentiment, their own sentimental feelings. And of course, we'll have heard this argument many, many times, and this goes back to the privative view, which is that nobody does evil for evil's sake. The evil is the corruption of the good. And so when people do evil things, they often do it because it makes them feel good. And that in itself, that the principle there is they're actually making themselves feel good. So the good is at the base. Now, I don't think that argument holds up really at all, because anybody who actually is doing evil because it makes them feel good, that's the definition of being an evil person. More of that later on when we talk about narcissism. So, therefore, from Kant then, at the root of the human being is the incorporation of the moral law and the mixing of that moral law with their own sentiments. And that certain level of confusion means there's a conflict at the heart of the individual. And this is what he saw in terms of three different pieces of this. He said the fragility of the human being. And the fragility is that these two inclinations, what he would call personal inclinations and moral inclinations, there's a battle sometimes between, and that's a fragile place to be. The second then is what he calls impurity. This is the mixing of these moral intuitions with the personal inclinations. So that's what he would call a part of the human fragility, which is that there's this mixture and sometimes confusion. And the third is what he calls wickedness. Now, wickedness is when a person makes the choice to either exempt themselves from the moral law. To exempt yourself from the moral law means that you no longer allow the law to be the thing that determines your behavior. You make that choice. You exempt yourself, or you subordinate. You admit the moral law is there. You say, yes, this is the good thing to do. This is the right thing to do. This is my duty, is to do this. But I just don't feel like doing it because I prefer to do something else. So I'm dominating the moral law with my own personal intuitions. Now, this is what Kant calls evil. I don't think that he's right about using the word evil for this. But what he's doing is he's showing what I would call the disposition or the propensity for evil doing. The dynamic in the human being is that this is at the core of evil doing. You can bring the consequentialist piece back in here, which is then that once the decision to overcome or to subordinate the moral law to your inclination, when that inclination is engaging in causing pain, suffering and harm, you are then responsible for evil. And this is, and in Kant's view, there is a propensity to do this in every human being. And what that means is there's a dynamic situation in the psyche of human beings which is fundamentally leaves them with a predisposition to evil. And this is what he calls radical evil. John Kopchak, another philosopher, gives us a good sort of summary of this. He said, what Kant's rigorism forces us to confront is not simply the occasional or partial combination of self-interested and purely moral motives, but the very subordination of the moral universal law to the imperative of self-regard. He locates in man a profound malignity which causes him to be bad even when he's good. Now that's an important piece of this. Moreover, Kant argues that this is not simply true of some of us, some of the time, but is universally true of all of us without exception. So the disposition to subordinate the moral good, the law and morality to our own self-interest and our own self-regard is at the core of all evil doing, and that exists in every human being. So we all have to come to terms with this. Now, to what extent we do that, to what extent our behaviors in life are driven by what Kant would consider that the moral law exists in and of itself for its own sake, and our feelings are not a consideration in this matter. And so it's kind of very perfectionistic, really, when you think about it. This is also quite close to a Christian understanding, but it's not. And it's very important here to make the distinction between Kant and the Christian view of sin, which can be very easily confused. Now, one of the Romantic poets, Goethe, he said at the time, and remember that Goethe would have been part of the Romantic movement, and Schiller and Herder, and in the following Rousseau, that whole movement at that time had taken a very, very optimistic view of the human beings and human morality. And so Goethe was very sarcastic in his conclusion about Goethe. So there's a lovely quotation worth repeating here, just for the sake of it's lovely to read good language and intelligent conversation. And Goethe says about Kant, he said, Kant criminally smeared his philosopher's cloak with the shameful stain of radical evil. After it had taken a long human life to cleanse it from the many dirty prejudices, so that Christians too might yet be enticed to kiss its hem. Goethe is saying that, his philosopher's cloak. So Kant was managing. You see, Kant dismantled Aquinas's proofs for the existence of God. Kant did, he really undermined so much of the rational, empirical, scientific approach to trying to prove the existence of God. So he did a lot of damage to people's Christian faith if they were grounding it on these kind of empirical, scientific notions. So he said he's criminally smeared his philosopher's cloak with the shameful stain of radical evil. So Goethe is saying radical evil, his concept of radical evil was just something he brought in, and he stained it, his philosophy, his legacy. And his legacy had taken his lifetime to do this. He was a marvellous philosopher, one of the great philosophers. And he had gotten rid of so much of what Goethe calls the dirty prejudices from Christianity, so that Christians too might yet be enticed to kiss its hem, so that he would then be acceptable back into the Christian fold, and that radical evil allowed him to do this. I don't think this is true. I think that Kant, first of all, did not see that the issue of evil was something that had anything to do with supernatural. The concept of original sin, which is that man is born already in a sinful state. Human beings are born in a sinful state as a result of the fall of Adam. That Kant would not have accepted that at all. And therefore all the necessities involved in Christianity and the sacrifice of Jesus to forgive our sins, infant baptism to cleanse us and to keep us out from hell, are things that Kant would not have accepted. Kant's view is much more closely related in the more modern times to evolutionary psychology, which we mentioned in our last session, which is this idea that actually there's a conflict at the heart of human beings. But the difference is that with the evolutionary psychologists, they are seeing this as something that is created as a result of our drive for the survival of the fittest. So our violence and our narcissism and all the rest of that are all about are grounded in the need to basically to empower ourselves to continue to survive, even if it means doing evil to others. That's not something that Kant would refer to. What he would see is self-interest and self-regard, which we call narcissism, is always at war with the moral law within. And we never really can know whether whatever their behavior is. We do know that when they're doing evil, when they're causing pain and suffering, but we don't know when they're doing good. And this is what Kopchak is saying. She says, he said that, he could be bad even when he is good. So the person who is smiling and at you and wanting you to buy something and convincing you that this is a really good thing for you and it's going to be helpful to you, and that they say that their best interest at heart and all that, which is a virtuous thing to do. But maybe they're not. Maybe they're being driven by selfish motives. And in that way, that refers to what he calls radical evil. Okay, there is another use of the word radical evil, which I'm going to briefly discuss now, and that comes from Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is hugely influenced by Kant, and she was a real fan of Kant, and you can hear the echoes of it in her work. However, Arendt changed her mind about this in time, but in the earlier part of her work, she used Kant's phrase radical evil, but she used it in a very different sense. Her interest was in collective evil, mass evil doing, totalitarianism, and how the state becomes an engine of evil, and how human beings engage with that. We mentioned in our first session collective evil. So Arendt uses it to describe what she calls making the human being superfluous. That's fundamentally the idea that she has, that the end point. So in her use of the word radical, she is using it in a form of extremity. And this is the idea that when a system makes the human being superfluous, it is now operating in a radically evil fashion. And this is very relevant to how our world is operating today, and perhaps always, but it just seems to be much more topical, really, because she sees this as having three stages in terms of how a governance and political systems will operate. And her first piece of radical evil, of the move to radical evil, is what she calls killing the juridical person. And killing the juridical person, what she means by that is, she means that when you strip away the person's rights before the law, you have started down the road of radical evil. Because the thing that prevents the absolute destruction of human beings is that they have protection, some form of protection. Now, it can be a very flawed form of protection, because we can see in the history of legal history that law sometimes didn't protect people very well. But in our world, the law is what is created by human societies to offer protection and care for human beings, so that they are actually given some kind of rights to justice. And killing the juridical person means when you take that right away from people. And she saw this as the first step towards the radical evil of totalitarian regimes. The other two pieces, and we will be going into this in much more detail in our next session, where we'll move into Hannah Arendt's work more clearly, is killing the moral person. And so when you kill the radical person, that means you take them away any protection from the law. Now they're really naked and vulnerable. The second thing then is when you treat them in such a way that their morality, they can no longer function as a moral person. And she would give examples of the Holocaust, of the camps, of torture. What happens when you can bring a person to a state where their morality is no longer functional? That's killing the moral person. Once that's happened, you can do whatever you want with them then. After that, the next piece is to kill the very soul of the person, to make them so that they are just a shell. And we'll discuss that in a bit more detail. So that's radical evil. That's tonight's or today's session on radical evil, where the main focus of that is in the work of Kant. It helps us to put meat to the bones of what might be called a dualist understanding of evil doing. What it means for us in terms of reflecting on it would be, does this make sense? Does this make sense as a human being to think that we have propensities within ourselves to override what we know is true and good and right? And to what extent do we do that? One other piece. Kant would have understood that everybody can do this. Everybody has that facility. But I don't think that Kant understood narcissism and psychopathy very well. Because I think when we would be looking at narcissistic evil, I think that one of the key understandings of narcissistic evil is that there isn't any code, moral system that is over against personal self-regard and self-care or self-indulgence or whatever. There isn't one. The person may actually sort of give some kind of verbal an assessment of themselves in some way morally. But actually, when you dig down deeper, they don't have any attachment to any moral code other than. So there is no conflict. I think this gives us an understanding of narcissism that is very well worth understanding when it comes to narcissistic evil. So thank you. I will, next session, session 4, we're going to move directly into another form of evil called banal evil doing, and this takes us directly into the work of Hannah Arendt and the famous or infamous study of Eichmann's trial, where she developed the concept of the banality of evil, and that will take us at least 2 sessions to cover that in any meaningful way. So until then, take care.